Hi, everyone. Let's talk about chapter 12. In this video, I will briefly talk about aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Make sure that you check out the other videos that are on D12 under the content tab for this chapter. And I would recommend you guys to review chapter 3. In chapter 3, we talked about demand and supply in one specific market, competitive market. In here, in this chapter, we're going to talk about, again, demand and supply, but at a bigger scale. We are going to talk about the total demand and total supply in the entire economy. But the concept is very, very similar to what we had in chapter 3. And the way that we're defining demand and supply, again, is very similar to chapter 3. But there's a huge difference between this chapter and chapter 3. As I mentioned, in chapter 3, we talked about demand and supply in one specific market, but in this chapter, we're going to talk about the demand and supply for the entire economy. Aggregate means total. So aggregate demand shows the relationship between price and the amount of goods and services that the entire economy can produce. And in the entire economy, we can have different types of producers. It can be individuals, it could be businesses, it could be the government. We have trade with other countries, so it can be also other countries because we have trade with them. So just like again, chapter 3, aggregate demand shows the relationship between price and the amount of goods and services that are produced in the economy. We call this quantity, the quantity of real GDP demanded. And inside this quantity demanded, we have all the components we had in chapter 7 for GDP. We have C, I, G, and net export, export minus import. And again, we have a downward slope aggregate demand because of the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, quantity of real GDP demanded. So that explains, we called it law of demand, if you remember in chapter 3. And this inverse relationship between price and quantity of real GDP demanded explains the downward slope shape for our aggregate demand. So we have kind of the typical shape for our aggregate demand here. If just like chapter 3, if the price level changes, there is no shift in aggregate demand. We're just going to move from one point to another point on the very same aggregate demand. But if anything other than price changes, there will be a shift. What do we mean by other factors? Other factors are C, consumption expenditures, investment I, government spending G, export and import. These are the factors that can shift our aggregate demand. If, for instance, consumption expenditure increases, our aggregate demand will shift rightward. If, for instance, investment decreases, our aggregate demand will shift leftward. If you remember in chapter 3, we called these other components. We had other components that could shift our demand in competitive market, like income, price of related goods, number of buyers, right? So that was for one specific market. But now we're talking about the factors that can change the entire demand in the entire economy, okay? So if price changes, there is no shift. Let me briefly talk to you about the factors that can explain the shape of aggregate demand and why we have this shape of downward slope aggregate demand. The first reason is because of the purchasing power of our money. And we learned in chapter 9 that there is a difference between price and price level, right? Price applies to the value of one specific product. Let's say the price of 1 pound of apple is $1. That's the price of apple. But price level is the price of all the goods and services in the economy, right? So since now we're talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we're going to use price level all the time because that applies to the average prices of all the goods and services we have in the economy. So if everything becomes more expensive, the purchasing power of your money will go down. So you are not able to buy as many products as before. The value of your money actually is going down. The value of dollar is just going down. So if price level increases, the quantity of real GDP demanded that you can purchase will go down. And of course, you can think about the opposite case, right? So that explains the negative relationship between price and quantity of real GDP demanded. That explains the downward slope aggregate demand. Another way that we can explain this downward slope shape for aggregate demand is because of the interest rate. And we will learn about the interest rate in future chapters. But briefly, if interest rates increases, our investment will go down. And remember, investment is part of the aggregate demand. The good thing actually about aggregate demand is inside the quantity of real GDP demanded, we have all those factors we introduced and all the components of GDP we had in chapter 7. Also, all these factors are the factors that can shift our aggregate demand. So it's kind of easy to remember, okay? What are the factors that can shift the aggregate demand, and what are the factors that also inside the quantity of real GDP demanded? So there is an inverse relationship between interest rate and investment. So if interest rate increases, our investment will go down, because interest rate is basically the opportunity cost of borrowing money. If interest rate increases, it means that borrowing money actually is more expensive. People are not going to invest much because investment actually is very, very expensive for them. And whenever there is a change in price, the price can also impact the interest rate. We will learn, as I said, more about it. But just for now, remember that if the price of goods and services, increases, it will impact the interest rate eventually. And it will also reduce the investment in the economy. Another way of looking at it is through the foreign purchases effect. What does it mean? So if the price level for the U.S. product actually if the price level, the price of goods and services within United States increases, and let's say the price of the product that we purchase from Mexico doesn't change, it is less expensive for us to import products from Mexico, right? Because the product inside the United States are high, they are expensive. So actually it's better if we buy the stuff from Mexico. So we're going to import more from Mexico, right? And we're going to export less. So our net export will go down. Price level inside United States is going up, net export is going down, quantity of real GDP demanded will go down. So there are three different ways that you can explain this downward slope shape for our aggregate demand: through the purchasing power of money, through the interest rate that we will learn more, and also the foreign purchases effect. There are three different ways that you can explain the inverse relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded. And as I mentioned, it's easy to remember the factors that can shift our aggregate demand rightward or leftward. Those factors are all the components of GDP: C, I, G, and net export. Now let's talk about aggregate supply. Aggregate supply means the total supply in the entire economy, in the macroeconomy. Aggregate supply shows the relationship between the price level and the quantity of goods and services that are produced within our country. We call it quantity of real GDP supplied. Okay. How much we can produce depends on the amount of labor, factors of production, basically, we had in chapter 1. How many laborers we have, how many hours of work how many hours a day they work. It depends on the resources we have. It could be natural resources, it could be human capital, it could be technology, and how we are managing our resources. So nothing but the factors of production we had in chapter in chapter 1. And this is the shape of our aggregate supply, typical shape for the supply. We have an upward slope aggregate supply, just like chapter 3. Again, this upward slope aggregate supply shows the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP supplied. If price changes, again, there is no shift in aggregate supply. If anything other than price changes, the aggregate supply will shift to the right if aggregate supply is going up, and aggregate supply will shift leftward if aggregate supply decreases. In this chapter, we are focused on only 2 factors that can shift or change our aggregate supply. The first one is the price of our resources, or input prices, or price of factors of production, and we are focused on the price of oil here. Just like chapter 3, if the price of resources increases, if they become more expensive, the aggregate supply will go down. As a result, there will be a leftward shift in aggregate supply. You can again think about the opposite case. Another factor is productivity. Productivity is the amount of output that is produced by 1 unit of input, okay? So the productivity of our resources, especially labor, can impact our aggregate supply. If we have a more productive labor, our aggregate supply will increase because we are able to produce more using less amount of resources or the same amount of resources. So the aggregate supply will increase. If the productivity of our resources decreases, aggregate supply will shift leftward. So there are more factors that can shift our aggregate supply, but remember, in this chapter, we are focused on these 2 factors only: price of input, especially oil, and productivity of our resources. Now that we are familiar with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, let's put them together to define our equilibrium. It's very similar to chapter 3, right? The steps we're taking, since we're talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, or the entire demand and supply in the market, when we put them together, we call this equilibrium macroeconomic equilibrium, or full employment, that we had also in previous chapters. At the equilibrium, at the macroeconomic equilibrium, our quantity of real GDP demanded is equal to quantity of real GDP supplied, just like chapter 3. We have 1 price, that's the equilibrium price, and we have 1 equilibrium real GDP. Again, very, very similar to chapter 3. So in this table, our equilibrium price level is $100, and our real GDP, quantity of real GDP demanded is 510, which is equal to quantity of real GDP supply, which is again 510. So again, the concept is very, very similar, and you can also see the macroeconomic equilibrium in the graph as well as the table. Again, just like chapter 3, you can think about shortage and surplus at the macroeconomic level. So if the price is below the equilibrium price, like here, you can have shortage. If it's above the equilibrium price level, we have surplus in the economy. Now, let's talk about shift at the equilibrium, or changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply at the equilibrium. In chapter 3, we did the same thing. In chapter 3, we shift our demand and supply when we were at the equilibrium, and we changed the demand, we kept the supply fixed, then we changed supply, we kept the demand fixed, and then we put them together, and we started shifting both demand and supply at the equilibrium. We called it complex cases. We're not going to talk about complex cases here. We're just going to talk about shifting demand when supply supply is fixed, and then we're going to shift the supply when the demand is fixed. So no complex cases here. But just be careful with especially changes in aggregate demand when we are at the equilibrium, because we have some important terminologies that we're going to, again, use in the future chapters, okay? So if aggregate demand increases, so there will be a rightward shift in aggregate demand, right? We know that it's very similar to chapter 3. Let me show you the graph. So we have our original aggregate demand, which is 81. For some reason, let's say investment is increasing, the economy is booming, so there are lots of investment in the economy. So aggregate demand is going to go up. So we have a rightward shift in aggregate demand. So we have a new aggregate demand, 82. Nothing is happening to the supply side of the economy. So aggregate supply is not shifting. So we are going to have a new equilibrium. At the original equilibrium, the price level was P1. Now the price is going up to P2. Look at also the amount of output in the economy. So we have QF at the beginning. That's the amount of GDP. And at the new equilibrium, the amount of GDP actually went up to Q1. So there is an increase in quantity here, right? But let me go back. So we have more output, we have a higher aggregate demand, so we have more output, which is a good thing, right? But there is a cost for us. We ended up with higher price level, meaning that we have more output in the economy, but everything is more expensive now. So we are actually dealing with inflation here. So there is also a gap between the real GDP and, let me go back again to the graph, real GDP and our potential GDP. Because remember, the potential GDP is again coming from the intersection of our demand and supply, or aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? That was the level of GDP when the economy is at full employment. But right now we are not at full employment anymore because the aggregate demand actually changed, right? And since we are dealing with inflation, we call the gap between real GDP and our potential GDP inflationary gap. So anytime that there is an increase in aggregate demand, we will end up with inflationary gap. And you will see that in the future chapters, we'll learn how the government and the Federal Reserve as a central bank in United States can help the economy when we have inflationary gap, because we try to avoid inflationary gap because again, we're dealing with inflation, right? We always want to go back to full employment. Remember full employment from previous chapters? Full employment is when there's no unemployment that is caused by the changes in the business cycle. We have normal changes in the labor market. We have only natural unemployment rate, right? Also, let's look at the opposite case. It is possible sometimes for the aggregate demand to decrease. Let's say consumption expenditure is just going down because the economy is slow, like right now that we're dealing with COVID-19. So if the aggregate demand decreases, there will be a leftward shift in aggregate demand. Let me show you the graph. So this time the aggregate demand is shifting to the left, and there is a basically shift from 81 to 82. The price level this time is going down, P1 to P2, but pay attention also to the level of output. Our real GDP is also going down from QF to from QF to Q2, right? So the level of output is going down, prices are going down, that's a good thing, but we have less amount of output. And remember, the aggregate demand is going down because there's something wrong with the demand side of the market here, right? And this example that I gave you, because we have recession. So we call the gap between the real GDP and the potential GDP here, recessionary gap, because the level of output is just too low. And remember, we have these two terminologies of inflationary gap and recessionary gap only when it comes to changes in aggregate demand. We do not have these terminologies for changes in aggregate supply. But you need to know these terminologies because, as I said, in the future chapters, we'll learn how the economy is going to be fixed by government or by the Federal Reserve as a central bank. Now, let's talk about the changes in aggregate supply. So this is our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the intersection of these two will give us a macroeconomic equilibrium or full employment. Now, and we know that, I know the diagram is a little bit different from your textbook, but I really like this one better than your textbook because it shows actually where the potential GDP is. Remember, since this graph right now is showing us the macroeconomic equilibrium and full employment, this 10 trillions of dollars will show the real GDP, will show the potential GDP because it is the level of real GDP when the economy is at full employment. Now let's change things. We are not going to, again, change demand and supply at the same time in this chapter at all. So now it's time for us to keep the demand, right? We're not going to shift the demand side of the market, of the economy, excuse me, it's the macroeconomic equilibrium. We are, however, going to change the aggregate supply. So let's say the aggregate supply is going up. So we have a rightward shift in aggregate supply from AS0 to AS2 because of, let's say, price of resources, oil prices. So the price of oil is going down. It means that the cost actually is going down. So we are able to produce more. So the aggregate supply is going up. There is a rightward shift in aggregate supply. Look at the graph. At the original equilibrium, macroeconomic equilibrium or full employment, the price of it was 110. The real GDP, which was equal to potential GDP, was 10. And now at the new equilibrium, the price went down. Price of it went down from 110 to 105. And at the new equilibrium, we are actually having more output, more real GDP. GDP went up from 10 to 10.25. So price is going down. Quantity or the amount of output actually is going up. That's a good thing for the economy. Everything is less expensive. We have more output. It matches with how we define expansion when we talked about business cycle, right? Economy actually is booming here. Everything is less expensive and we have more output for everybody. That's great. Remember, this is a short run, by the way. Now let's talk about reduction in aggregate supply. Let's think about the opposite case. Oil is more expensive as a price of resource. You can think about also land, labor, anything, but our examples here are all about oil. So the aggregate supply will go down because the cost actually is going up. So there is a leftward shift in aggregate supply. At the new equilibrium, look at the price. Price actually went up. Everything is more expensive than before. So we are dealing with inflation. Also, look at the real GDP. The original real GDP or our potential GDP was 10. Now the real GDP is 9.75. So what happened? We have less amount of output and everything is more expensive than before. It's horrible. We call this situation stagflation because we are dealing with inflation and recession at the same time. We have recession because the level of output went down. We are dealing with inflation because price level went up. Everything is more expensive. So stagflation is the combination of recession and inflation. Okay. That's pretty much it for this chapter. I definitely want you guys to pay attention to the diagrams, to the terminologies we had, like recessionary gap, inflationary gap, expansion, stagflation. Know the components that can shift our aggregate demand, shift our aggregate supply, know the shape of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, typical shape, but just know them. And also pay attention that how we define macroeconomic equilibrium. We're going to come back to this chapter when we talk about fiscal policy, monetary policy, even when we talk about money and banking. I hope that you learned something, and see you soon.